"You should be grateful my son even married you," my mother-in-law said with a smile that made the entire table uncomfortable. Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected her. They simply continued eating as if comments like that had become normal. The truth is they had. My name is Victoria Hayes. I am 67 years old, and for most of my marriage, I learned that silence was often easier than explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Crawford, had spent years convincing herself that I was somehow beneath her son. Richard was a celebrated chief executive officer. His photograph appeared in business magazines. He gave interviews on financial news networks. He spoke at conferences attended by thousands of people. According to Eleanor, those accomplishments placed him on a level that ordinary people could never reach. And according to Eleanor, I was one of those ordinary people. The strange part was that she never actually knew what I did for a living. She never asked. She assumed. Over the years, assumptions became facts in her mind. At family dinners, she would introduce Richard with pride. She would list his achievements, his awards, and the growth of his company. Then she would gesture toward me and say something vague. Victoria keeps busy. Victoria has her little career. Victoria enjoys reading. Every description managed to sound polite while somehow making me seem smaller. I stopped correcting her years ago. Not because I agreed, but because I understood something important. People reveal their character through the way they treat those they believe have no power. Last Sunday, the entire family gathered at Eleanor's country club for her 72nd birthday celebration. The private dining room overlooked a golf course stretching across rolling green hills. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight. Waiters moved quietly between tables. Everything looked elegant. Everything felt carefully arranged. During dessert, one of Eleanor's friends asked what I did professionally. Before I could answer, Eleanor laughed softly. "Nothing nearly as impressive as Richard," she said. "My son runs a company. Victoria lives in a different world entirely." Several guests smiled awkwardly. I noticed Richard staring into his coffee cup. He did not defend me. He rarely did. Eleanor continued speaking. "Some people are simply born for greatness. Others are lucky enough to stand nearby." The comment earned a few uncomfortable chuckles. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled politely. Years earlier, remarks like that would have hurt. Now they simply taught me more about the people making them. The conversation moved on. The room relaxed. Nobody realized I had already received an email earlier that morning that would change everything. My phone rested silently inside my purse throughout the entire luncheon. The message waiting there contained a name I never expected to see attached to a newly assigned legal matter. A name I knew better than anyone in that room could imagine. Richard Crawford. As Eleanor continued telling her guests how unreachable her son had become, I sat quietly and listened. Because for the first time in years I knew something she did not. And within a matter of weeks, that secret would place us all in the same room under very different circumstances. The following Monday began like countless others. I arrived at the federal courthouse shortly before 7:30 in the morning, carrying a leather briefcase that had accompanied me through more than 2 decades of public service. The building stood in downtown Boston, its granite exterior catching the first light of the day. Most people who passed through those doors never knew much about the judges working inside. That anonymity suited me perfectly. I had spent years building a life where my work spoke louder than my title. After passing through security, I greeted familiar staff members and made my way to chambers. A stack of files waited on my desk. New motions, scheduling requests, administrative reports, routine matters that filled the hours of nearly every week. Near the bottom of the pile sat the case assignment notice I had received the previous day. I picked it up again and read the name carefully. Richard Crawford. Even after seeing it multiple times, the reality felt strange. Not because I was emotional. Not because I was conflicted. Judges are trained to separate personal relationships from professional obligations. What unsettled me was the coincidence itself. Out of thousands of cases filed every year, this one had somehow landed on my docket. I opened the file and reviewed the preliminary information. The lawsuit involved allegations surrounding corporate governance, shareholder disclosures, and financial decisions connected to Richard's company. The amount at issue exceeded $340 million. News organizations were already covering the story. Analysts were offering opinions. Investors were asking questions. The legal process, however, would proceed according to evidence rather than headlines. That was how it always worked. Around noon, I attended a scheduling conference with court administrators. Nobody mentioned Richard. Nobody knew the connection. To them, he was simply another litigant attached to a major commercial dispute. As the meeting ended, I found myself thinking back to the birthday luncheon. Eleanor's confident smile. Her certainty. Her belief that influence only flowed in one direction. She had spent years treating success as something visible. Expensive offices. Public recognition. Magazine covers. She never understood that some of the most important positions in society operate quietly behind closed doors. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Richard. Seeing his name on my phone surprised me. We spoke only occasionally these days. His schedule remained demanding, and our conversations had become increasingly formal over the years. When I answered, he sounded distracted. He mentioned business pressures, media attention, the growing stress surrounding the lawsuit. I listened patiently. At no point did he mention that the case had been assigned to my courtroom. At no point did I volunteer the information. Certain conversations are best delayed until the appropriate time. Before ending the call, Richard sighed heavily. Some days it feels like everything is happening at once, he admitted. I looked out my office window toward the city skyline. Then perhaps this is the moment to focus on what you can control, I replied. After we hung up, I returned to the file on my desk. The first hearing had already been scheduled. In less than 3 weeks, everyone involved would gather inside my courtroom. And for the first time in many years, assumptions that had survived an entire family history were about to collide with reality. Over the next 2 weeks, life settled into a strange rhythm. Outside the courthouse, the lawsuit continued attracting attention. Financial reporters discussed potential outcomes. Business analysts debated the implications for Richard's company. Every morning, headlines appeared. Every afternoon, new opinions followed. Yet inside my chambers, the case remained what every case must remain: a collection of facts, arguments, evidence, and legal questions waiting to be examined fairly. I focused on my responsibilities and ignored the noise. That was not difficult. I had spent most of my career learning how to separate public attention from judicial duty. What proved more difficult was dealing with Eleanor. Somehow she sensed that something significant was happening, even though she did not understand what. She called repeatedly. She invited Richard and me to dinner. She organized a family gathering the weekend before the first hearing. I almost declined. In the end, I attended because avoiding people rarely solves anything. The gathering took place at Eleanor's home. Her dining room looked exactly as it always had. Polished silver. Perfect place settings. Family photographs displayed prominently on every surface. The room celebrated achievement, at least the kind of achievement Eleanor considered important. Throughout dinner, she spoke endlessly about Richard's company. She praised his leadership. She repeated stories about magazine interviews and industry awards. Several relatives listened with admiration. Others simply nodded out of habit. Then Eleanor turned toward me. "Victoria has always preferred a quieter life," she said with a pleasant smile. "Not everyone enjoys the pressure that comes with real influence." A few people laughed softly. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I noticed it immediately. Something had changed. In previous years, he often ignored comments like that. This time he looked embarrassed. Before I could respond, Eleanor continued. "Of course, some careers matter more than others. That is simply reality." I picked up my glass of water and took a small sip. Years ago, I might have felt compelled to defend myself. Now I understood that people reveal more about themselves than they do about others. "Reality has a way of surprising us," I said calmly. Eleanor smiled politely, though the expression never reached her eyes. The conversation moved on, but Richard remained unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. As guests began leaving, he walked me to my car. The summer air felt warm. Crickets chirped from nearby trees. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Richard sighed. "I wish she would stop doing that." I looked at him. "Doing what?" He glanced back toward the house. "Treating people like their value depends on their title. The honesty surprised me. Before I could answer, he continued. Sometimes I think she believes success is the only thing that matters. I studied his expression carefully. For the first time, he sounded tired of carrying expectations that had followed him his entire life. As I drove home later that evening, I thought about our conversation. In 3 days, the first hearing would begin. Richard still had no idea who would be sitting on the bench when he entered that courtroom. And neither did Eleanor. The morning of the hearing arrived with clear skies and unusually cool temperatures for late summer. I arrived at the courthouse before most of the staff, carrying the same briefcase I had carried for years. The routine felt comforting, familiar, predictable. That was one of the reasons I valued the law. No matter how much attention a case received, the process remained the same. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Procedure mattered. Everything else was noise. By 8:30, the building had begun filling with attorneys, reporters, and court personnel. The lawsuit had attracted enough public interest to draw a larger crowd than usual. From my chambers, I reviewed the schedule one final time. Motions would be addressed. Preliminary arguments would be heard. No dramatic verdicts. No immediate resolutions. Just the beginning of a long legal process. Shortly before 9 o'clock, my clerk informed me that all parties had arrived. I thanked her and gathered my notes. Then I took a slow breath and walked toward the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere felt noticeably tense. Attorneys organized documents. Reporters filled the public seating area. Spectators whispered quietly among themselves. Near the front of the room sat Richard. Even from a distance, I could see the strain on his face. Weeks of public scrutiny had taken their toll. Beside him sat members of his legal team. A few rows behind them, I noticed Eleanor. The sight surprised me. She rarely attended professional events involving Richard. Apparently, this case had become important enough to draw her attention. She looked confident, comfortable, completely unaware of what was about to happen. When the courtroom deputy announced my arrival, everyone stood. The room fell silent. I entered through the side door and took my seat behind the bench. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then I watched recognition spread across Richard's face. First confusion, then disbelief. His eyes widened slightly before he quickly regained composure. Years of executive leadership had taught him how to control visible reactions. Still, the surprise was unmistakable. A second later, Eleanor looked up. The expression that followed was one I will never forget. Not because it was dramatic. Quite the opposite. It was the look of someone discovering that reality had been operating independently of her assumptions for many years. She stared at me without blinking. The confident smile she had worn during countless family gatherings disappeared entirely. Around the courtroom, nobody understood the significance of the moment except the three of us. To everyone else, I was simply the judge assigned to the case. The hearing began. Attorneys presented arguments. Scheduling matters were addressed. Procedural questions received answers. Throughout the entire session, I treated every participant exactly as I would have treated anyone else. Professionally, fairly, respectfully. That was my responsibility. Yet I could feel Eleanor watching from the gallery. Not with anger. Not even with embarrassment. More with confusion than anything else. As though she was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. When the hearing finally concluded, I gathered my papers and prepared to leave the bench. Before exiting, I glanced briefly toward the gallery. Eleanor was still sitting there. Silent. Thoughtful. For the first time since I had known her, she looked like someone questioning her own certainty. When the courtroom emptied, I returned to chambers and closed the door behind me. For several minutes, I stood quietly beside the window overlooking the city. Below, people moved through their day without knowing anything about the complicated intersection of family and professional responsibility that had just unfolded inside courtroom 4. That anonymity felt comforting. The law was never supposed to be personal. Yet life has a way of placing people in situations they never expect. My clerk entered carrying several documents requiring signatures. We reviewed scheduling matters, procedural deadlines, and administrative requests. Everything continued exactly as it should. The case would proceed according to established rules. Nothing about that had changed. Around noon, however, My assistant informed me that someone was requesting a private meeting. The request came from Eleanor. I declined immediately. Judges do not hold private discussions with relatives connected to active litigation. The rules existed for a reason. An hour later, Richard requested a meeting as well. I declined that request too. Professional boundaries mattered now more than ever. Late that afternoon, as I prepared to leave the courthouse, I found a handwritten note waiting on my desk. Security had screened it before delivery. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. The message was surprisingly brief. She wrote that there were things she did not understand and questions she wanted to ask. There was no criticism, no sarcasm, no references to Richard's success, only confusion. I folded the note and placed it inside a drawer. Some conversations require the right setting before they can happen honestly. That evening, I returned home and sat on the porch overlooking the water. The air carried the first hints of autumn. A gentle breeze moved across the shoreline. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think about the years behind me. I thought about law school, long nights studying while working part-time jobs, early career assignments that required sacrifice, promotions earned slowly rather than inherited. None of those achievements had happened overnight. None of them had depended on family approval. Yet somehow, despite everything I had accomplished, Eleanor had spent years reducing my identity to comparisons with her son. The irony was that Richard himself seemed less interested in status than she was. My phone rang shortly after sunset. This time it was Richard. I hesitated before answering. When I finally did, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he quietly said, "I never knew." I looked across the darkening water. "You never asked," I replied gently. Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just honest. "She is having a difficult time processing all of this," he said. I knew exactly who he meant. "Perhaps," I answered. "She is finally seeing people as they actually are instead of who she assumed they were." After the call ended, I remained outside long after darkness settled across the shoreline. Somewhere across the city, Eleanor was probably replaying years of conversations in her mind. And for the first time, I suspected she was beginning to understand that respect is not something granted by status. It is something revealed through character. The second hearing took place 3 weeks later. By then, media coverage had intensified. Financial publications analyzed every filing. Industry commentators speculated endlessly about possible outcomes. Yet inside the courthouse, none of that mattered. The law does not bend to headlines, and it certainly does not bend to public opinion. That morning, I arrived early and reviewed the latest motions before taking the bench. The courtroom filled quickly. Attorneys arranged exhibits. Reporters settled into their seats. Spectators whispered quietly. Among them sat Eleanor once again. This time, however, she carried herself differently. The certainty that had defined her for years seemed noticeably diminished. When proceedings began, both sides presented detailed arguments. Complex financial records were discussed. Corporate decisions were examined. Witness schedules were established. Throughout the session, Richard remained professional and composed. I respected that. Regardless of the challenges surrounding him, he approached the process seriously. Several times our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. Neither of us acknowledged the family connection. We did not need to. Professionalism required distance, and we both understood that. During a short recess, I returned to chambers and reviewed additional materials. As I worked, I found myself thinking about something Eleanor had written in her note. There were things she did not understand. The more I reflected on those words, the more I realized they described much more than my career. For years, Eleanor had misunderstood the nature of achievement itself. She believed success could be measured through visibility, through titles, through recognition, through admiration from others. She never seemed to notice the quieter forms of accomplishment: integrity, discipline, consistency, service, the qualities that rarely generate applause but often matter most. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere felt calmer. The attorneys focused on facts. The discussions became more precise. By late afternoon, the session concluded. As people gathered their belongings, I noticed Eleanor remaining seated long after others began leaving. She looked thoughtful rather than upset, reflective rather than defensive. It was a subtle change but an important one. Later that evening, I attended a small family dinner at Richard's invitation. The gathering included only a handful of relatives. Nothing elaborate. No speeches. No celebrations. Just a meal shared among people who seemed unusually aware of one another. At one point, the conversation shifted toward careers and accomplishments. In previous years, Eleanor would have dominated the discussion. This time she listened more than she spoke. Eventually, one of Richard's cousins asked how long I had served on the federal bench. Before I could answer, Eleanor surprised everyone. "A very long time," she said quietly. "Long enough to earn every bit of it." The table fell silent. Nobody seemed to know how to respond. Neither did I. For several seconds, Eleanor stared down at her plate before looking up again. There was no dramatic apology. No emotional speech. Just a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than anything she had ever said before. And for the first time since this entire journey began, I sensed that something inside our family was finally beginning to change. Over the following months, the lawsuit continued moving through the legal system exactly as it was supposed to. Hearings were held. Arguments were presented. Documents were reviewed. The process demanded patience from everyone involved. What surprised me most was not what happened inside the courtroom, but what began happening outside of it. Slowly, the dynamic within our family started changing. The transformation was subtle at first. Eleanor stopped introducing me as an afterthought. When relatives gathered, she no longer redirected every conversation toward Richard's accomplishments. Instead, she seemed to listen more carefully than before. It was as though years of certainty had finally given way to curiosity. One Sunday afternoon, several family members gathered at Richard's home for a casual lunch. The atmosphere felt relaxed. Children played in the backyard. Conversations drifted from travel plans to favorite restaurants and retirement goals. At one point, one of Richard's younger cousins asked me how I had chosen a career in law. Before I could answer, Eleanor quietly said, "That is actually a story worth hearing." The comment caught my attention immediately. Years earlier, she would have changed the subject within seconds. Instead, she leaned forward and listened. So I told them about my first internship. I spoke about studying late into the night while balancing work and school. I described the mentors who challenged me and the mistakes that taught me resilience. For nearly 20 minutes, nobody interrupted. When I finished, several relatives asked questions. Not because of my title, but because they seemed genuinely interested. It felt strangely refreshing. Later that afternoon, Eleanor and I found ourselves standing alone on the patio overlooking the backyard. The autumn leaves had begun turning shades of gold and red. Families moved through the house behind us while a cool breeze drifted across the yard. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Eleanor surprised me. "I spent a lot of years being proud of the wrong things," she said quietly. I looked at her but remained silent. She continued staring toward the trees. "I thought success was something people could see immediately. I thought recognition proved value." Her voice carried none of the confidence that had once defined her. Only honesty. And I was wrong. The admission was simple. There was no dramatic apology. No emotional performance. Just truth. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. "People learn at different times," I replied. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I wish I had learned sooner." Back inside the house, Richard was laughing with relatives near the dining room table. Watching him, I realized something important. For years, Eleanor's expectations had shaped not only how she viewed others, but how she viewed her own son. She had placed him on a pedestal he never asked for. Perhaps this experience had freed both of them. As the afternoon came to an end, family members began saying their goodbyes. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in years. Not perfect. No family ever is. But healthier. More honest. As I drove home that evening beneath a sky painted with the colors of sunset, I found myself smiling. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are not found in court decisions or public recognition. Sometimes they happen quietly, when people finally begin seeing one another clearly. Winter arrived before the lawsuit finally approached its conclusion. Snow lined the sidewalks outside the courthouse, and the city moved with the slower rhythm that always seemed to accompany the colder months. Inside the courtroom, however, the pace remained steady. Months of filings, Testimony and legal arguments had gradually narrowed the dispute to its essential questions. By that point, most of the public attention had faded. Reporters who once crowded the gallery now appeared only occasionally. The headlines had moved on to newer stories. I found that reassuring. Important decisions should never depend on public fascination. They should depend on facts. One afternoon, after a particularly long hearing, I returned to chambers and reviewed the final submissions from both sides. The amount of work represented in those documents was enormous. Attorneys had spent countless hours preparing them. Experts had contributed analyses. Witnesses had provided testimony. Every piece formed part of a larger picture. As I read through the material, I felt the same responsibility I had felt throughout my entire career. Every person who entered a courtroom deserved fairness. Nothing more. Nothing less. That evening Richard called. Our conversations had become more frequent over the past several months, though they remained thoughtful rather than casual. He no longer sounded like the confident executive who assumed every problem could be solved through effort alone. The experience had changed him. In some ways it had humbled him. No matter what happens, he said during our conversation, I am grateful for something. I waited. What? He was quiet for a moment. I finally understand how much of your life I never bothered to learn about. The honesty caught me off guard. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was sincere. For years, our family had lived beside one another while carrying incomplete versions of each other in our minds. Perhaps that was more common than most people realized. We see what we expect to see. We hear what confirms what we already believe. Everything else becomes invisible. A few days later, Eleanor invited me to lunch. It was the first invitation of its kind she had ever extended. No family gathering. No audience. Just the two of us. We met at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor. The atmosphere was quiet, comfortable. As we ate, our conversation wandered through subjects we had somehow avoided for years. Childhood, memories, career choices, regrets, lessons learned. At one point, Eleanor set down her coffee cup and looked directly at me. You know, she said softly, I spent years believing I knew exactly who you were. I smiled slightly. And now? She shook her head. Now I realize I never really took the time to find out. There was no need for anything more. Some apologies arrive as speeches. Others arrive as understanding. When lunch ended, we stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the sky. As I watched them disappear against the harbor water, I realized the lawsuit had already accomplished something none of us expected. Long before any final legal outcome, it had forced a family to confront the difference between assumptions and truth. Several weeks later, the lawsuit finally reached its conclusion. By then, the excitement surrounding the case had largely disappeared from public conversation. Reporters moved on. Commentators found new topics. The attention that once seemed so overwhelming faded into the background, leaving only the work itself. On the morning of the final proceedings, I arrived at the courthouse feeling the same sense of responsibility I had carried throughout my entire career. The outcome would be determined by the facts, the law, and the evidence presented before the court. Nothing else mattered. When I entered the courtroom, I noticed how different everything felt compared to that first hearing months earlier. Richard appeared calm, focused, more grounded than before. Eleanor sat quietly in the gallery. She no longer carried herself like someone evaluating the worth of everyone around her. Instead, she seemed content simply to observe. The proceedings moved forward with professionalism and respect. When the final matters concluded, people slowly began gathering their belongings. Attorneys shook hands. Staff organized files. The long chapter that had occupied so many lives was finally coming to an end. As I prepared to leave the bench for the last time in that case, I looked briefly across the courtroom. Richard offered a small nod. It was not a gesture of victory or defeat. It was a gesture of understanding. Months earlier, we had been connected by assumptions and expectations. Now we were connected by something much more valuable: honesty. Later that evening, our family gathered for dinner at Richard's home. There was no celebration, no grand announcement, just family. The atmosphere felt warmer than it had in years. Conversations flowed naturally. People listened to one another. Nobody competed for attention. Nobody measured success through titles or accomplishments. At one point, Eleanor raised her glass and smiled. I spent a long time believing that achievement was the most important thing a person could have, she said softly. The room became quiet. Now I think character matters more. No one rushed to respond. The simplicity of her words carried enough weight on its own. I looked around the table and realized how much had changed. Not because of a lawsuit. Not because of professional status. But because the truth had finally replaced assumptions. The years of comparisons, judgments, and misunderstandings had gradually given way to something healthier. Respect. As the evening came to an end, I stepped outside onto the back porch. The night air felt crisp and peaceful. Lights from neighboring homes glowed softly in the distance. Behind me, I could hear the quiet sounds of family continuing their conversations inside. For a moment, I simply stood there and reflected on everything that had happened. The greatest lesson was not that titles can be impressive. It was not that success can be influential. The greatest lesson was that people often underestimate those they never truly take the time to know. In the end, I did not need recognition to prove my worth. I never had. What mattered was remaining true to who I was, regardless of what others believed. And perhaps that was why, after everything was over, I felt something far more satisfying than victory. I felt peace.